I'm 28 now, and I've learned that some people don't lose their family in one dramatic moment, they lose them slowly, in the quiet daily choices that add up until you wake up one day and realize you've been living in a house where your name never truly belonged. My mother died giving birth to me, and even though no one ever said the words out loud when I was small, I could feel them hanging in every room like dust you can't wipe away. She's gone because you're here. I don't have a single memory of her voice, her hands, her laugh, but relatives told me she wanted me more than anything, that she fought for years to become a mother, that when she finally got that miracle, she treated my existence like a promise she'd been waiting her whole life to keep, and it's a cruel kind of irony that the only person who should have loved me without effort never got the chance. Our home wasn't a home, not really, it was a shrine. Her photos were everywhere, smiling from frames on the walls, standing on shelves like silent witnesses. Her clothes still hung in the closet, untouched, as if she might walk back in any minute and slip into them. Her books stayed lined up in neat rows, their spines fading with time, their pages never turned. It felt like I lived with the ghost of a woman I couldn't remember, and sometimes, when the house was empty and the air was especially still, I would sneak into my parents' bedroom and touch her things the way a child touches something sacred, trying to force a connection into existence. Like if I held on long enough, I might finally understand what it meant to be wanted. My father was there physically. He made sure I ate, made sure I had clothes, made sure I got to school, but emotionally he might as well have been on a different planet. There were no hugs, no soft words, no proud smiles, not even the simple warmth other kids seemed to receive without having to beg for it. He spoke to me the way you speak to a task you didn't choose but still have to complete, and when he did speak, it was usually to criticize, to correct, to compare, as if the only way he could look at me was through a lens of disappointment. And then there was my cousin Ethan. Ethan's father, my uncle, died in a car accident when Ethan was 7. And I still remember the day the news came in because it was the first and only time I saw my father cry. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was at the kitchen table doing homework, the kind of boring routine moment that feels like it should be safe, when the phone rang. My father answered, and his posture changed so suddenly it was like the air had been punched out of him. His face crumpled, his hand tightened around the receiver. And when he hung up he sat down at the table and stared into space for what felt like hours, the way someone looks when they've been pulled out of their own life and dropped into grief without warning. After that, Ethan started spending more and more time at our house. At first I was excited, because I was lonely, because I was a kid and a kid wants another kid around, and because some small hopeful part of me thought maybe having Ethan there would soften my father, make him open up, make our home feel less like a museum. But it didn't take long to understand what was happening. Ethan didn't just become a presence in our house. He became a mirror my father used to show me everything he thought I wasn't. Why can't you be more like Ethan? Ethan would never do that. Ethan has more common sense. Ethan understands how the world works. Ethan was outgoing, charming, athletic. The kind of kid teachers liked and strangers smiled at. And I was quiet, shy, always carrying a book. Always living inside my own head because the world inside pages felt kinder than the world inside my house. Ethan became the son my father wanted, and I became the reminder of what my father had lost, the living proof that life moved forward without permission. So I tried. God, I tried in a way I'm almost embarrassed to admit now. I joined sports teams even though I hated the noise of it, the shouting, the pressure, the way my stomach twisted before games. I studied harder than I needed to. I tried to learn my father's interests like they were a foreign language I could master if I practiced enough. I kept telling myself that somewhere there was a right version of me, a version that would finally unlock his affection, that if I could just find the right combination of achievements and obedience, he'd look at me and see a son instead of a mistake. When I was around 12, I won a science fair with a model of the solar system, planets that moved in perfect circles, gears and wires I'd built with my own hands after weeks of work. I carried that trophy home like it was proof, like it was a key, like it was the one thing he couldn't ignore. He was in the living room laughing with Ethan about a football game. I told him, breathless, "I won. He nodded without looking away from the TV. That was it. Not, good job. Not, I'm proud. Just a nod, as if I'd told him the trash had been taken out. In high school the comparisons got worse because Ethan and I were in the same grade, and people joked about it like it was cute, like we were rivals in some harmless story. But to me it felt like I was constantly being measured and constantly being found lacking. I did better in school than Ethan, consistently, and my father still downplayed it. Ethan has more important things to think about than grades, he'd say, like intelligence was a weakness and not a tool. One day, at a parent-teacher meeting, my English teacher, Ms. Ramirez, praised an essay I'd written so enthusiastically her eyes lit up. She told my father it was one of the best papers she'd ever read from someone my age, that I had a real voice, that I could be a writer if I kept going. My father grunted and asked, "Is that going to get him a scholarship for sports?" "Mess." Ramirez blinked, confused, and I sat there burning with humiliation, because in that moment I realized my father didn't even know who I was, he only knew what he wanted me to be, and even that was mostly just Ethan. Still, I held on to the dream that college would be different, because college was the place where people left home and became themselves, where the past couldn't follow you so easily, where the version of me my father refused to see might finally have room to exist. I worked hard, got accepted to a decent university, and even though I knew money would be tight, I believed, stupidly, desperately, that my father would help at least a little, because this wasn't a luxury, it was my future. And then I overheard him. I was walking down the hallway and heard my father on the phone with Ethan, his voice warm in a way I'd rarely heard, telling him he would pay for his entire college tuition. I stood there like the floor had disappeared. When I confronted my father, my voice shaking, asking if he could help me too, he looked at me like I was crazy, like I was asking for something outrageous. "Ethan needs it more," he said. "I can't afford to pay for both of you." That was the moment my college dream didn't just get delayed, it got amputated. I tried anyway. I took a part-time job at a diner, worked evenings and weekends, applied for every scholarship I could find, lived on cheap food and exhaustion, juggling classes and shifts until my body felt like it was made of frayed rope. There was always something that had to give: sleep, grades, sanity. And after the first semester I realized I couldn't do it. Tuition didn't care that I was trying. Bills didn't care that I was tired. Determination didn't magically turn into money. So I dropped out. And while I was sitting in my tiny room staring at the numbers that didn't add up, Ethan was posting photos from his campus, his clean dorm, his new laptop, his trips, his weekends, everything my father had funded with the same hand that had pushed me away. Every post felt like a knife turning slowly, not because I wanted Ethan to suffer, but because I couldn't understand how my father could invest so much in someone else's future while letting mine collapse right in front of him. That winter, I packed my things. I walked out of the house that had never truly felt like mine, and I cut contact with both of them, because sometimes leaving isn't dramatic, it's just the first honest act you do for yourself after a lifetime of begging for love you were never going to get. And as I drove away, with my hands tight on the steering wheel and my throat burning, I realized the most painful truth of all. I wasn't leaving because I hated my father. I was leaving because I couldn't keep hating myself for wanting him. The first year after I left felt like living inside a storm that never fully moved on, only changed direction. I didn't have a plan that sounded impressive, no secret savings, no safety net, no comforting voice telling me it would all work out, because the people who are supposed to be that voice had spent my whole life teaching me that I was on my own. So when I finally chose to be on my own for real, it wasn't a rebellion as much as it was an acceptance of reality. I moved to a place where no one knew my name, because I needed distance from the version of me that had been shaped by constant comparison, the version that still flinched inside whenever someone raised their voice, the version that automatically assumed love was something you had to earn through performance. I found a tiny studio room I could barely afford, the kind with thin walls and a window that looked out at a brick building, and I took whatever jobs I could get. I cleaned during the day, offices, hallways, bathrooms that smelled like bleach and disappointment. And at night I worked behind a bar, pouring drinks for people who laughed too loudly, flirting like life had never hurt them, while my feet ached and my clothes carried the scent of smoke and beer. Some nights, when I stumbled back into that studio after midnight, too tired to even take my shoes off properly, I would sit on the edge of the bed and wonder if I'd made a mistake, if I'd been foolish to walk away, if pride had cost me stability. And then I would remember the house I left behind, the silence that felt like punishment, the way my father looked through me, and the question would answer itself. Leaving was painful, but staying would have destroyed me. I worked construction for a while when the bar shifts weren't enough, hauling materials. Learning quickly because slow learners don't last long when your rent is due. I waited tables again. I worked a night shift at a gas station for a few months where the hours were long and the customers were either exhausted or angry, and sometimes both. I learned how to stretch a budget so far it felt like magic, how to buy the cheapest coffee and still convince myself it was a small comfort, how to fall asleep the moment my head hit the pillow because exhaustion doesn't allow you the luxury of overthinking. But what surprised me was that even in that struggle, in that constant grind, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in my father's house. Freedom. It was quiet and almost invisible at first, like the first warm day after a long winter where you don't fully trust the sun yet, but it was there. When I did something well, I wasn't waiting for my father's reaction anymore. When I had a good day, I didn't immediately brace for someone to downplay it. When I messed up, I didn't hear that voice saying it proved I was less than Ethan. I was still wounded, still carrying old hunger in my chest, but little by little I began to realize that life could be built from the ground up, even if you didn't start with the same materials other people did. After a couple of years, I landed something stable, a job as a manager at a local bookstore. It wasn't the glamorous career my teenage self had imagined when I pictured a university degree and a clean office and a future that didn't involve counting pennies, but it was steady, and it felt like me. The store smelled like paper and ink and quiet ambition. People came in looking for stories that might save them, and sometimes I understood that more than they knew. I learned the rhythms of inventory and staff schedules and customer moods, and in a strange way, building order in that small space helped build order inside me too. And because I refused to let my father's choice be the final sentence of my life, I enrolled in night classes at the community college. It was slow, not the fast track I'd once wanted, but it was mine. I'd sit in classrooms after a full day of work, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and I'd take notes with tired hands, telling myself that progress doesn't have to be dramatic to be real. Some nights I'd walk out to my car with my backpack heavy and my eyes burning from fatigue, and I'd think, this is what my father never paid for, this stubbornness, this refusal to vanish. The best part of rebuilding, though, wasn't just the job or the classes. It was the people. I made friends the way adults make friends, slowly, awkwardly, through shared routines and small moments that turn into trust. A coworker who invited me to a game night. Someone from class who offered to study together. A couple who lived nearby and always had room at their table. Over time, those connections formed something that felt almost impossible to me, a chosen family. We had weekly game nights where the laughter felt honest. We went camping when we could afford it, eating cheap food by a fire and staring at the sky like it might tell us something comforting. When one of us struggled, the others showed up, not with perfect advice, but with presence, and that alone felt like a miracle. For a long time, I convinced myself the past was behind me. Not healed, maybe, but at least far away. I stopped checking Ethan's social media because each photo still carried a sting I didn't want to keep touching. I stopped replaying the old scenes of my father's indifference as often, because new scenes were finally forming. My promotion at the bookstore, passing a hard class, paying rent without panic. Then, out of nowhere, my phone rang. The number wasn't saved. I almost didn't answer, because unknown calls are usually junk, but something in me did, and the moment I said hello, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in 3 years. My father. For a second, I couldn't breathe. His voice sounded older, rougher, worn down in a way I'd never heard before, like time had finally started charging him interest for every cold choice he'd made. He began with small talk. How are you? Where are you living now? Are you doing okay? And it felt forced, like he was reading lines he didn't understand, trying to pretend the last 3 years hadn't happened. Then he got to the real reason he'd called. He needed money. Not a small amount. Not a one-time favor. He needed help in a way that suggested he was desperate, the kind of desperation that strips pride down to bone. And the irony hit me so hard I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was unreal. This was the man who'd refused to help me pay for college. The man who'd chosen Ethan over me in 100 quiet ways. The man who watched my future collapse and did nothing. Now he was asking me to rescue him. I asked the question before I could stop myself, because it rose up from a place that still ached. Why are you calling me? Why not Ethan? There was a long pause. Then my father mumbled something about Ethan being busy, about Ethan not having the means right now, about work being complicated. I actually did laugh then, a short, sharp sound that surprised me, because it was the laugh of someone watching a story flip upside down. For years I'd been told Ethan was the better one, the chosen one, the one worth investing in, and now, when my father was drowning, Ethan wasn't there to throw him a rope. My father started talking again, and this time his voice softened in a way that might have been regret, might have been manipulation, might have been both. He said he was sorry. He said he'd made mistakes. He said he wanted to make things right. And for a moment, a small part of me, the little boy who used to sneak into my mother's closet and touch her clothes, leaned toward those words like they were water. But then the adult part of me, the part that had lived on ramen and cheap coffee and exhaustion, the part that had carried his own life on his back without help, stepped forward and spoke instead. I told him, calmly, that I wasn't a bank. I told him it was too little, too late. I told him that if he needed help, he should go to the person he'd built his whole world around. And then I ended the call. The moment the line went dead, I felt a wave of emotions crash through me so fast I couldn't name them all. Anger, sadness, guilt, relief. Because even when someone has hurt you for years, turning your back on them still feels like you're breaking a rule you were born believing in. That night, I lay awake replaying the conversation, asking myself if I'd done the right thing, and the memories came back the way they always do when you're tired and vulnerable, not as a neat timeline, but as sharp flashes. The first heartbreak at 16, when Megan broke up with me for one of the football players and I came home with red eyes, hoping, just once, my father might notice. He didn't. He grunted and told me I was blocking the TV. The day I got my driver's license, the thing most kids celebrate with their dads. I had to beg my neighbor, Mr. Harris, to teach me because my father never did. When I passed, I walked into the garage excited, holding that little card like it meant something, and my father was there with Ethan, explaining something about an engine. Ethan congratulated me. My father nodded and kept talking to Ethan. I remembered all of it, and as painful as it was, it did something important. It reminded me that my father was not reaching out because he finally saw me. He was reaching out because he needed something. And as the days passed, the doubt inside me slowly quieted. Because for the first time in my life, I had chosen myself. Still, curiosity is a stubborn thing. I kept wondering what could have pushed my father into this kind of desperation. What kind of trouble was big enough to make him swallow his pride and call the son he'd spent a lifetime treating like an afterthought, and why the golden child, Ethan, was suddenly absent when it mattered. I told myself I shouldn't look into it, that I should protect my peace. But the truth is, when you grow up in a house full of unanswered questions, you carry the habit of searching for answers even after you've escaped. And eventually I gave in. Curiosity doesn't always come dressed as drama. Sometimes it's just a quiet itch behind your ribs that won't stop until you finally scratch it, even if you already know it's going to sting. A few days after my father's call, I sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and my phone in my hand, staring at old contacts I hadn't touched in years, and I told myself I was doing this for closure, for understanding, for the adult version of me who deserved answers, but if I'm being honest, a part of me was still that kid in the shrine house, still trying to solve the puzzle of why I had never been enough. The first person I called was Mrs. Caldwell, my mom's best friend. Growing up, she'd been one of the few adults who spoke to me like I mattered, like my presence wasn't a problem the world had to tolerate. And when she answered, her voice softened the moment she recognized mine, as if time folded in on itself for a second and we were back in those old days when she'd show up with casseroles and patience and a sadness she tried to hide from me. We did the small talk dance at first. How are you? Where are you living? Are you eating enough? Are you taking care of yourself? And then I asked the question that had been sitting in my throat since the phone call. Why would he need money? I said. What happened? There was a pause, the kind where you can hear someone choosing their words carefully, not because they want to lie, but because they want to tell the truth without cutting you open. And then she sighed, long and heavy. It isn't just college, she said quietly. It never was. She told me my father had gone all in on Ethan far beyond tuition, helped with a down payment on a house, bought him a car, paid for expensive opportunities. And whenever Ethan had a new dream or a new plan, my father treated it like a sacred mission he had to fund, like if he poured enough money into Ethan's life, he could somehow buy his way out of his own grief. To do it, she said, he'd taken out loans, maxed out credit cards, dug himself deeper and deeper until the debt stopped being a number, and became a weight that followed him into every room. And the worst part, Mrs. Caldwell added, her voice turning bitter in a way I'd never heard before, is that he talked about it like it was a point of pride. Like he was building a legacy. Like he was proving something. I sat there listening, my fingers tight around the phone, and in my mind I could see my father's face, the way he looked straight through me my whole childhood, and I felt that familiar, ugly twist, anger and disbelief and something like grief for the boy I used to be. Mrs. Caldwell told me about a conversation she'd had with him a few years back, how he'd bragged about Ethan's success, his big future, his business mind, and when she'd asked about me, my father had shrugged and said he hoped I was doing okay. Just hoped. Like I was a distant coworker, not his son. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat in silence for a while, because knowing the truth didn't magically heal anything. But it did confirm something I needed to accept. My father's love hadn't been withheld because I failed some secret test. It had been withheld because he was broken in a way he refused to face. Still, one piece didn't fit. If my father had spent all that money on Ethan, why wasn't Ethan helping now? So I called Mr. Harris, the neighbor who taught me how to drive when my father wouldn't. He answered with the same steady warmth I remembered. Like some people carry decency the way others carry keys, without thinking about it, and when I brought up my father, he didn't sound surprised. I figured he'd call you eventually, Mr. Harris said. Then he filled in the last, cruel details. Ethan, apparently, had convinced my father to invest in a startup, some tech thing launched with college friends, the kind of venture that sounds like the future until the future doesn't show up. My father had remortgaged the house to get the money, because when you're desperate to believe someone is special, you start calling recklessness support. The startup flopped. Ethan's shiny new job wasn't going as well as everyone had claimed. And when my father turned to him, when the debt rose up high enough to block the air, Ethan said he couldn't help. Mr. Harris told me he'd overheard an argument recently, loud enough to carry through an open garage door. My father demanding answers, Ethan insisting it wasn't his fault. The market changed, Ethan promising he'd pay him back when he could. And then, like the final insult, Ethan peeling out of the driveway in a flashy new car while my father stood there looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. When Mr. Harris said that, a part of me felt something sharp and shameful. Satisfaction. Not because I wanted Ethan to fail, not because I wanted my father to suffer, but because for once reality had spoken louder than the story my father forced on me for years, the story where Ethan was gold and I was disposable, the story where Ethan deserved everything and I deserved comparisons. But the satisfaction didn't last. It drained out of me almost immediately, replaced by something heavier: exhaustion, sadness, the quiet ache of realizing that even karma doesn't give you back your childhood. After I hung up, I stared at the wall and thought about all the alternate lives that could have existed if my father had invested in me the way he invested in Ethan, the degree I might have finished, the career I might have entered sooner, the years of scrambling I might have been spared, and for a moment the old anger rose up again, hot and familiar. Then I thought about the truth I didn't want to admit. The struggle shaped me. It made me resourceful. It made me stubborn. It forced me to build a backbone out of necessity. It taught me how to create a family out of people who actually showed up. And it made me stop begging for love from someone who never learned how to give it. That night, I sent my father a text. Not a cruel one. Not a triumphant one. Just a simple message that said I knew what had happened with Ethan and the debt, and that I hoped, finally, he could see his choices had consequences, not only for him, but for me too. Hours passed. Then his reply came, long enough that my phone screen couldn't hold it without scrolling. He said he was sorry. He said grief had turned his heart into something hard and angry, and that he'd spent years punishing the wrong person because he didn't know what to do with the weight of losing my mom. He said he knew he'd been unfair, that he knew he'd missed my life in 1,000 ways that couldn't be repaired by one apology. And then he wrote one line that hit me like a hand on my chest. Your mother would have been proud of the man you became. I won't pretend that fixed anything, because words don't undo years. But it did something strange inside me, something tender, something painful. Because my whole life I'd been living in a house where my mother's memory was everywhere except in anyone's love, and for the first time, even through the wreckage of it all, I felt like she wasn't just a photograph on a wall. He asked to meet. He asked to talk. He asked, in his own clumsy way, to start over. I held my phone for a long time, staring at that request, feeling two versions of myself pull in opposite directions: the boy who still wanted his father to choose him, and the man who had survived not being chosen. In the end, I texted back the truth. I told him I wasn't ready. I told him I appreciated the apology, but that apologies don't erase neglect, and they don't automatically earn access to the life I fought to build. I told him he needed to respect my boundaries, and I told him clearly that I would not be bailing him out financially, that his choices brought him to this point, just like my choices brought me to mine. When I hit send, I expected to feel guilt. Instead, I felt something like air. Not happiness, exactly. Not victory. Relief. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't reaching for his approval like it was oxygen. I wasn't twisting myself into shapes to earn warmth that never came. I was simply standing where I stood, in the life I'd built, with the dignity I had to teach myself. A week later, my friend Chloe asked me to help her move into a new apartment. We carried boxes up narrow stairs, laughed when something didn't fit, ate cheap pizza on the floor when we were done, and at one point I looked around at the people in that room, friends who showed up, who stayed, who made space for each other without needing a reason, and it dawned on me with quiet clarity that this was what family was supposed to feel like. Not a shrine. Not a competition. Not a constant test you keep failing. Just belonging. And as I drove home that night, the city lights blurring softly through my windshield, I realized something I wish I could have told my younger self, the boy who touched his mother's clothes in secret, and wondered what was wrong with him. There was never anything wrong with you. Some people are just too lost in their own grief to see the person in front of them. And I can't change what my father chose. But I can choose what I carry forward. Some stories don't end with apologies. They end with understanding. If this story felt familiar, you're not alone. Thank you for listening. This was Block Tales.